Wat deed je, Sassenach? A dream for some. Can be a nightmare for others.
Sometimes life takes unexpected turns.
With the, it's interesting, the aspect of fate and destiny versus the idea of controlling, how life goes. And it's interesting to look at Claire and how she decides what she wants to do. And obviously going into this season, she's very clear. Could you talk about that from your perspective, looking at her psychology of the time periods and then playing her in that way?
Yeah, I mean, I feel for the season 1 and 2, Claire was a very reactionary person. There was all of these events unfolding around her, and she was basically just surviving from moment to moment. Last season, we started exploring a little bit more about when she goes after what she wants. But this season, I feel like really it's a culmination of a lifetime in a way of her desires and her finally being able to sort of put every side of her life in one place. And I think it's a much more self-nurturing side of Claire than we've ever really had the chance to explore before. So in some ways it's a quieter side. She's really investing in that idea of home and family, and it's not necessarily the kind of running around and fighting and searching that we've maybe explored before. But I think there's an awful lot of value to this more internal and self-care side of her than we've been able to look at in previous seasons. So it was a nice change for me, and I think as an actor it's always nice to be able to explore another side of your character and be surprised by them and be surprised on the journey that you get to take them.
Do you know what lies beyond those trees? This is just the start of what America will become. People will come here in their thousands, all hoping to live the American dream.
Is that the same as our dream?
I suppose it is.
Cold water roll away.
Welcome to River Run.
Thank you, Auntie.
North Carolina offers wealth and prosperity.
I don't agree with keeping people as property. You're a lively one,
And also the aspect of, obviously, the relationship between Claire and Jamie, also considering, like last season, when they reunite, and not to give anything too much away, is, just seeing how the relationship changed and how it sort of, evolved. Can you talk about looking at that? Because that's also a discussion between you and the creators and everybody putting it together, but also between you and Sam. Could you sort of talk about that and that sort of gestation of that relationship in that way?
Yeah, I mean, last season when they finally found each other again, I mean, it had been 20 years that they'd spent apart. So they were really trying to rebuild this relationship. And I think when you've put someone up on a pedestal for 20 years, there's an awful lot of fantasy that you build around that. But in order for them to really connect on a proper human level again, they needed to really discover the real people that they are now in this new time. So there was insecurity, there was doubt, there was those things that they were trying to break through and work past as a couple. But this season, they've gotten past that now, and we can't really, I think after all of that, put them on any cliffhangers anymore. They're really solid now, and there's a contentment and a settled nature to their relationship now that we really haven't had as much before. So it was quite nice, and they're sort of older now, and they're settled. I mean, this season is really about home, and for both of them, that's each other, but it's also about creating this wider version of home and family that they've never really had in prior seasons.
And obviously, I don't want to give anything really away about the season that's coming, that you guys are promoting now. But it's about the future. It's about looking at that sort of ambition. And I mean, obviously, America plays into it. Could you sort of talk about that idea. And the idea, it's interesting that the American dream is mentioned many times, and that has changed over the years, and even the elements of what dictates America. Could you sort of talk about that? Because I think it's an interesting subject at this time.
Yeah, I mean, it was very interesting to start exploring that side of American history. Being Irish, it's not something I really grew up with. But, this is a family of immigrants who came to America, and the time that, America and the democracy that we know of America today, when it was first being formed and decided upon, and, those initial ideals were being born all around this time. So it's interesting to see Jamie and Claire come in at this time, lose everything and have to rebuild their lives from the beginning again, while at the same time also coming into contact with their Cherokee neighbours, and the sort of conflict there, and what that means to be settlers on land that was already, I suppose, occupied. So it's a really interesting point in American history, and it was very interesting for all of us non-Americans to explore that. And I hope, people really enjoy looking at that, for this season.
Well, I mean, obviously the kicker of the series is that Claire has knowledge of what happens and how it goes, and it's interesting how that can sort of dictate certain, ambitions and certain, motivations that she has, and yet still the ideas of what they want to explore, and the things that you guys want to explore within the characters. Could you talk a little bit about that? Because that's psychology. That's always been really fascinating about Claire, that she'll make certain decisions despite knowing certain ideas. Could you talk about that? Because I think that's a really neat paradox of her in many ways.
Yeah, well, we've seen them try to change the course of history before and fail badly. So I think there's a knowledge there that whatever they come up against or whatever is going to happen, it's going to happen regardless. So that puts Claire in quite an interesting predicament, because having that foreknowledge, what do you do with it? Do you try and work around it, or do you try and work within these things that are going to happen? And we really see that come into play this season. It's basically, okay, well, now that we have sort of cards in our hand that tell us a little bit more about what's going to happen, how are we going to play it to our advantage rather than try and, I suppose, change things? And the interesting thing that you talk about, the psychology of Claire, sometimes there's one thing in knowing something, and it's another thing to see something firsthand. And I think especially last week's episode, we really saw that, there's the rational side of Claire, who understands sort of the bigger picture and knows what's going on in history, but the emotional side of maybe seeing some of these things up close and at first hand, sometimes that emotion can take over and you can end up doing things rashly that maybe make things worse. But, I think sometimes you just can't help it. And it was interesting to see Claire sort of lose that control over her own emotions slightly.
Well, I mean, yeah, and it's all about the details. And even as you were saying, the fact of that it maybe is a quieter, more introspective Claire, but yet there's so much that's said just by a movement, by a look, by these things. It's just very, very simple elements that are very hard to make look effortless. Could you sort of talk about it? It's the details, it's the rings, those kinds of things, the ruby, just the way those are played, just touching the ruby very slightly is such a big sort of character move in certain ways, even though it's done very minutely. Can you talk about that kind of acting and sort of approaching it that way in a character that is at times in the past seasons been more outgoing in that type of acting?
Yeah, well, I mean, I've been so lucky with this character. I've been given such a gift. I mean, she's such a wonderful character to play. And, especially season 1, though, so much of what Claire knew or who she was, she could never share. So there's so much going on internally, and especially with her observations or her thoughts or feelings that she always had to keep to herself. So it's been a really beautiful mix of being able to play these quieter moments that are much more internal, and also then the big action pieces or these sort of very overtly passionate pieces. So she's been such a gift in that way. But I think, we're now 5 years into this season, and there's a comfortability with her. Like I feel like I know her so well, even though even though, you know, sometimes we think we know ourselves and then we'll do something that completely surprises ourselves about us. But so she's quite similar in that way. But, you know, the whole crew, the whole team, we're sort of a very cohesive unit at this point. And it's so important, you talk about those little details, but it's so important, you know, with the prop masters and the art department, that all of these things feel so real and honest and authentic, and that gives you real specificity as an actor. And that's such an important thing, is to be so specific in your actions or in your movements or in your thoughts. And I think, you know, I'm lucky that I get to work with such a cohesive team that helps to feed that at every moment.
We must leave. Live on our own terms.
It's perfect.
If I can make this a good land, my presence here now can be felt by Brianna later, then that would be something.
I'm Stephen Bonnet, sir. Be wary. Travelers in these woods are set upon by thieves and outlaws.
There are savages here.
Oh my God.
Shouldn't she know the truth? Hello?
Brianna.
I have some news about your mother.
And my last question, thank you so much, I really appreciate it, is the aspect, it's connectivity. We were talking about the smaller details, but it's also larger picture. I mean, you know, there's one thing that that Sam's character says, that Jamie says, you know, is like, it'd be interesting to see how our daughter sees this in the future. And it's how you look at how everything fits together. It's the big pieces of the smaller pieces of a larger whole, and what it means over time. Like the time that they spent apart sort of created a sort of new idea of what things needed to be, you know, and maybe it changed from being something from being adventurous to something much, much deeper. Can you talk about the notion of time and connectivity and doing things that people will understand, look back? And this is true of the series. You know, people will look back at the series, you know, in years and look at it and see certain things, and okay, this is what I was doing at this time when I experienced this life that Claire and Jamie had. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, well, you know, I think the beautiful thing, you mentioned that line that Jamie says, you know, about putting something into this country that may have an effect on Brianna in the future, and that's such a beautiful thought. It's the fact that we get to, our actions have repercussions much longer and much further than we ever could imagine. So this idea that if they put something good into this land and good into this country, and in some way are part of a positive molding of what America will become, that Brianna will feel that repercussions. And in a way, that's how he envisions how he gets to parent. And that's such a beautiful thought. You know, and for me, it's I suppose you want to talk about with the show, you know, it's such a beautiful thing that we're putting a show out that's so much about love and positivity. And I think that, I hope that I can look back in years and think, oh God, I've put something really good out, and I've been part of something that's been, you know, putting a positive message out there, which I think we need.